The Mischievous Adventures of Mr. Whiskers. Once upon a time in the quiet little town of Willowbrook, there lived a mischievous tabby cat named Mr. Whiskers. He belonged to old Mrs. Jenkins, who was known far and wide for her delicious cookies. Her secret recipe was so famous that people traveled miles just to get a taste of her warm, gooey chocolate chip cookies. Mrs. Jenkins was preparing for the annual Willowbrook Bake-Off and had spent the entire day baking dozens of cookies. Exhausted, she left the kitchen with a plate of cookies cooling on the counter, and she warned Mr. Whiskers in her usual stern tone, "Mr. Whiskers, don't you dare touch those cookies. Don't you dare touch those cookies, Mr. Whiskers. They're for the judges tomorrow." Mr. Whiskers, however, was no ordinary cat. He had a nose for trouble and an appetite for adventure, or, more specifically, cookies. He waited until Mrs. Jenkins went upstairs for her afternoon nap, then he sprang into action. With the stealth of a jungle tiger, he leapt onto the counter and sniffed the cookies. Surely, he thought, just one won't hurt. So, he nibbled a cookie. But it was so good, he ate another. And another. Before he knew it, the entire plate was empty. Suddenly, panic set in. The bake-off was tomorrow. What would Mrs. Jenkins say? He paced back and forth, his tail twitching with guilt. Then, he had a brilliant idea: "I'll bake new cookies myself." He scurried to gather the ingredients. Flour dusted his whiskers, chocolate chips stuck to his paws. Somehow, he managed to spill a bag of sugar all over the kitchen. After a chaotic hour, Mr. Whiskers proudly stared at his creation, a batch of odd-shaped, lumpy cookies. They didn't look like Mrs. Jenkins' cookies, but they'd have to do. The next morning, Mrs. Jenkins came down to find the kitchen in a state of utter disaster, and a peculiar plate of cookies on the counter. Before she could scold Mr. Whiskers, the cookies caught her eye. Curiosity got the better of her, and she tasted one. To her surprise, it was delicious. Mr. Whiskers had accidentally created something new, a crunchy on the outside, gooey on the inside cookie with a hint of fish. He had mistakenly added some of his cat treats to the mix. At the bake-off, Mrs. Jenkins reluctantly entered the cookies under the name Whisker Wonders. To everyone's surprise, they won first place. The judges praised the unique and daring flavor profile. From that day on, Mrs. Jenkins and Mr. Whiskers became a baking duo, creating all kinds of quirky recipes. And while Mr. Whiskers still got into trouble now and then, he learned to turn his mistakes into opportunities.